Well, welcome back for another episode 6, I believe we're at, of Wrenches, Gadgets, and Hacks. I'm your host, Carl Storms, here with the podcast about technology for the curious and creative in the AEC and beyond. We have our wonderful guest host for this series, John. How's it going, John?
Doing pretty good. Glad to be here. How you doing?
Glad that you made it for all the episodes, John. I know you kept threatening that you might not make it back, but we're glad you're here.
Made it through the 6.
Yes. And for our episode today, our very special guest, Zach. How you doing, Zach?
Hi, thanks for having me here. I'm excited to talk about hacks and wrenches.
Absolutely. If you got a monkey wrench, that's we're all happy to have you.
Excellent. Let's do it.
All right. So before we jump into the fun of enjoying AEC technology off the clock, this is your moment to tell us a little bit about yourself and maybe what you do on the clock.
Oh, geez. It's always a good question. Like, what is it that you do, Zach? This is, I don't know if you guys have this problem, but can you explain it to small children what it is that you do? Like, I always feel like that's the challenge. Like, can you explain to small children what it is that you do? I still haven't figured out how to do that. My role is I'm product manager at Autodesk, which roughly means I talk to a lot of architects and engineers and owners and vendors and all sorts of people that are involved in the AEC process to talk to them about what it is that they need to do and the kinds of things that they need to build. And I go back and I talk to development teams and lawyers and designers and other product managers, and we sort of coordinate on sort of what's the most important thing for us to build. And for, I think, all of your listeners who are probably pretty familiar with Autodesk, we build a lot of different stuff. So sort of within that, I've been involved in a bunch of different products at Autodesk. Before that, I was an architect for a number of years before going over into working directly on the technology. And we have a lot of people like that at Autodesk, a lot of people who started off in various industries that now they contribute to the construction of the design technology for it. So I started off working in Revit, doing a lot of work there, developing sort of offshoot products of Revit and doing a lot of work sort of in the geometry side of that. Got involved with a little project that we called Dynamo, which grew and grew and grew over the years and is now pretty popular, and we're pretty proud of where that came to. A couple years ago, I switched gears a little bit and decided to go and start working on some cloud products. We had recently acquired a group called Spacemaker, which was a cloud-based early design and planning product, which we've been developing and has sort of evolved into something called Forma, which is out on the market right now. Allows for early stage design, a lot of environmental analysis, a lot of sort of understanding the behavior of your building in order to make better decisions about how it goes. So that's sort of been my arc over many years at Autodesk.
Nice. It sounds like a pretty good arc, and it also sounds that there's definitely some curiosity there as you're moving around and getting into things. So I think you found yourself in a perfect spot to talk about that. But before we get into that, one thing that I have to sort of bring up, because you were talking about where you've sort of been and moved around and dealing with geometry and Dynamo, does that also mean that you had your fingers in a little something called Vasari?
I did have my fingers in a little something called Vasari. I love Vasari. That was a lot of fun. We learned a lot of stuff in that. So for those who didn't know, I think back in like 2010 to 2012, maybe somewhere in there, way back, we essentially made a branch of Revit that sort of cut out a whole lot of parts of Revit, made it sort of lightweight design environment that was sort of focused on the conceptual modeling tools in it and some of the analysis tools, and sort of cut out all the rest with an idea of just sort of making a parametric modeling tool for doing early stage design and being able to sort of understand a lot of the implications of what it is that your design does, which might sound a lot like the description that I just gave for what Forma does. It's coming at that idea from a pretty different place, but still focused on that idea of there's a lot of things that we can predict about how our buildings will behave in the world, and we can tell a lot about what their impact is going to be on the world and the environment from a very, 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 very early stage of development. And that's what all this stuff has really been about. That's sort of like the before and after Dynamo aspect. And in the middle, that piece of Dynamo is really about getting down to how is it you can really start working with data and design and geometry within a very focused environment for that kind of interaction.
Did Vasari ever officially lose the title project? Like, was it ever out of the project stage?
Nope, it was a technology preview. And maybe sometime off the clock we can have a beer and talk about what happened there. But yeah, no, it allowed us to sort of find out a bunch of things, and one of those things was that it wasn't quite ready to sort of be a marketed product. So, but a lot of the stuff that we did, it's kind of like,
Oh man, we used the wind tunnel.
What's that? Yeah,
We
it's
loved
kind
the
of
wind
like,
tunnel.
yeah, it's kind of like, when we send people to the moon, it wasn't that we sent people to the moon and set up tourism, but we sent people to the moon, and then we had all this other technology that came out of it that we used for all sorts of other things. So, you went to the moon and people came up with Tang and Mylar blankets and intercontinental ballistic missiles. And we came up with a bunch of other things that ended up surfacing in Revit, really, ultimately, and a lot of other sort of environmental analysis technologies that came out of that. And Dynamo.
Yeah.
And
That was
actually,
my
to
first
some degree,
introduction
also
to
Forma
Dynamo.
came out of that. So, yep.
Yeah. Dynamo and Forma are like the two children from Vasari that I use the most, and the wind tunnel ended up pushing us to the flow analysis, flow, I think, CFD,
Yeah.
whatever that software is. We were using that for our wind tunnels for buildings, but we did a ton of wind tunnels at the firm I was at for higher ed. So we did the courtyards. We'd always run a wind tunnel on it just to kind of see where all the trash will gather,
Crash vortexes.
Oh man, lots of them too.
Yeah, turns out. Yeah, no, that was a lot of fun. Those were interesting projects.
Well, I think that's part of the reason why everyone has such a fond memory of Project Vasari is the fact that it was short-lived. A lot of great things came from it. But like anything else, if it had gone on to become an actual product and go through, eventually the love goes away. So I think sometimes it's even better to have that short little starburst, if you will, and then carry on.
Well, and I mean, I'll give another plug for the stuff that I'm working on right now. Forma really picks up the torch on a lot of that kind of work, because one of the things that we were also trying to do with Vasari was, how can we get it onto people's machines so that they can get up and running on it really fast? And one of the things that happens with that is, like, it's not just to sort of get it on your machine and get it up running really fast. It's so that people feel like they can update it really fast. So, a lot of our stuff that we make is like 8 gigabytes, and you need to sort of plug in all these other pieces, and it's hard to deploy. And one of the things that we were experimenting with Vasari was virtualization software, which allowed you to sort of encapsulate everything into like one little executable, and you could just like run it, and bam, you get a very small thing. You can expand it really quickly. It starts up really fast, like all of that stuff, with the idea that if you can do that, then whenever you make an update to it, people can get it and get up to the latest thing really fast. Again, with the idea of, we wanted to sort of make it so that people can immediately understand sort of the impact of their designs and get the analysis done. What we've been doing with Forma is we've gone way past that in terms of like, how fast can people get it and get up and running with it. It's entirely a cloud-based application. And what that means is that not only do you not have to install it at all, but we're updating it all the time. So that's something that's also going to be pretty weird, I think, in some ways for the existing AEC community, is how does that work when, we're improving it while you sleep? And you might, you're using it one day and you go home and you have dinner and then you go to sleep and you come back in the next day and there's something different. Might be better, but it's different. And people, that's a different culture. It's a different way of working. And I'm really excited to sort of see where that stuff goes too. So
That's awesome.
It is. And as someone that works for a SaaS company, I can understand the part about it. Just one day it's just different. Sometimes you don't notice it's different, but sometimes we get emails. So, it's a good and bad thing.
Yep. Who moved my cheese?
Exactly. Which I think, Not necessarily the cheese part, although big fan of cheese, but the idea of it being Forma being cloud-based brings us nicely back around to the idea of dabbling with AECO tools off the clock, is that makes it easy to do that, to get a hold of it. Another product from Autodesk that's like that is Fusion 360. I think it's still called Fusion 360. A lot of that, we talked about that on the first episode when we talked about 3D printing, how that's a great tool that people can get a hold of, makers can use. There's a free version to dabble with to make the wonderful things that they're going to 3D print. So I think the idea of having these things available in the cloud makes them easy for us to enjoy them whatever time of day it might be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a bunch of stuff that's like that, and I think you guys have given a shout out to it. There's another tool that I feel like doesn't get enough sort of, praise, but there's a tool called Tinkercad, which, it's a 3D modeling application. It's been part of Autodesk since I think 2014 or 2013. Simple interface, primitive modeling, enormous in the educational community. And part of that is just like, it's just so friggin' easy to get to and use. And then it has all this other stuff that's kind of amazing, was like way ahead of its time in terms of, you can 3D print anything from it pretty much. And part of the reason for that is, you take a cube and you take a sphere and you put them together and you subtract one from the other, and it does all this stuff and it does it really fast. Those are like really complicated pieces of geometry to process, like doing those sorts of Boolean operations where you take one thing out of another thing, and it's doing all of that stuff on a back-end service, and you're interacting with it all the time. But on the back end, it's figuring out things like, how do we make sure that this is a solid and that you can always print it? And so that whole way of interacting with, like, there's a bunch of stuff that happens on your computer in front of you that's real time, and there's a bunch of stuff that is really smart back in some data center in Kentucky, and it just sort of feeds you that stuff while you're not looking, and it just allows you to sort of move fast where you need to and do heavy compute in other places. And again, like, they were doing that back in like 2012, like, before it was cool, before people knew like how to do that. So that's a piece of technology that I think is really a good model.
I agree that we don't talk about it enough, because it even does simulation, like circuit simulation and everything. Last time I looked at it,
physics in it,
yeah, it's like, it's pretty nuts. And then touching on any of the cloud stuff, for all this to kind of be cross compatible with the operating systems is always really important to me. So like something like Forma, just being able to fire it up, you at home on your Mac, you're at home on your Chromebook, whatever the heck you want, you can fire it up probably. That's one thing, as the more time I spend in this industry, the more things I have to install on a machine, the more I'm like, come on, I just want to be able to access it anywhere I am, so definitely.
Well, and also I'm a big fan of the idea of accessibility for, the age range of people that are using Tinkercad is super impressive. It is used in professional environments, it's used in grade schools. And people kind of poo-poo that stuff a lot about, like, oh, is this something that's for kids? It's like, I mean, if it's for kids, great. Then, like, then I can probably understand it,
Yeah.
Turns out if it's good for one, it's good for others. So,
Yeah. No, I agree.
Yeah, very much so. It has code blocks in it now too. Their version of Dynamo visual nodes, which also reminds me of another much maligned, because it's for kids, product, Scratch. A lot of learning inside of that. I used to use it all the time in my Dynamo talks as a gateway into Dynamo, and its little, I want to say Guelphs, the little cat that dances. Definitely worth it,
Well, there's a bunch of stuff that's all, I mean, man, we could really get into this if you want. I mean, it's kind of out of the, like, what do you do out of your work time? But the growth of Scratch over the last 20 years is also another one of these things where it's, there's a whole contingent of people that grew up on visual programming interfaces like Scratch, who, if you look at the trajectory of that product of Scratch as a thing that sort of emerged in the early aughts, and the group that was getting exposed to that early on, they're all professionals now. Like, those are people who, like, I can't remember, I haven't looked at those numbers in a little while, but I think that, like, the sort of the first uptick in the use of Scratch like those people are something like 27 or 28 right now, something like that. So that people just have an assumption that I can describe a behavior and get stuff. Like, that is a totally different mindset for somebody to grow up in. Unless, you know, I mean, there's people that have been that way for a while, like all of us weirdos that sort of did something with, like, you know, early Macs or something where you would, you know, do something in BASIC or something like that. But this is like a giant segment of the population that has an assumption that I can describe something and it will end up in a physical artifact or a virtually physical artifact. And I'm just super excited about that wave of generational thinking that's going to be very, very different and is impacting the world in a very different way.
Absolutely. And I think that brings us into the generation that we're going to have growing up now with AI and having an interface or a box where you can tell it something and it will do the coding for you. You don't need to have visual, you don't need to have knowledge, it just does it for you. There's some downside to that, as I've learned in the last 100 days or so, but that's for a different conversation.
Yeah, no, it's what a time to be alive. It's going to be very different. It's, you know, and the ways that people are building those sorts of, you know, large language model implementations as part of professional applications is mind-blowing. We've been, you know, been using it for everything from like making Excel formulas to starting to see how people are building Python nodes and that sort of thing for our existing applications. And yeah, hold on to your butts.
Exciting times are coming.
It is. It is. But yeah, so I don't know. I'm super optimistic about sort of, you know, technology and where it takes us in the world. But, you know, and yeah, and I use it on and off the clock as you guys do.
So I guess that brings us into the conversation here. It's always a snaky road to get there, but the idea of, you know, enjoying that off the clock. So I know you have lots of forays into that. You know, one of the most current is doing some art with digital plotters, but you've been doing it for a long time. I've been a big fan of your pumpkin. You know, every Halloween for many years, there would be some sort of pumpkin parametric device made. What other ways have you been, you know, taking advantage of what you do during the day when you're having fun after the clock stops? Clock
Sure.
stops.
Well, I guess first of all, I've been lucky enough to not be not be hourly for a very long time. So the downside of that is like there's never an off the clock in some ways. But I've been very lucky in that I've been able to work with really smart people on very fun projects for a long time. And so it gets very fuzzy about like when am I working on work and when am I working on stuff that isn't work. But yeah, I've always in getting ready for this show, you know, Carl was asking some questions and I looked up some of the presentations from 10 years ago or something, there was something from one of the Built conferences that I did, which was how to use Revit for making toys and gifts for your family and friends. And, you know, I'm astonished that they actually sort of accepted that talk. I think it had like, there was a paper toy monster on the last page that if you had a pair of scissors, you could cut it out of the last page of the handout and make a little like finger puppet. You know, that's always been part of my world. Like I've you know, well before Autodesk, well before I was digitally enabled or anything, there was always making stuff of things that are at hand. And I mean, a big part of it for me has always been sort of an aspect of cheapness. Of it's fun and easy to experiment with things that feel like they are low cost. And low cost really depends on who you are and what's cheap to you. So, you know, when I joined Autodesk, the thing that suddenly became really cheap to me was Revit, which is not cheap to everybody, I realize, but it was just abundant, you know. It was, you know, I could have it on all my computers, I could have it at home, and I could sort of be interacting with it all the time. So that aspect of, okay, here's something that's, you know, abundant. What can I do with it that's just part of, you know, I gotta make a birthday card for somebody. And, you know, we people who have backgrounds in architecture and technology, you know, we get to do things that are sort of magic to other people, but are sort of, you know, daily grind for us. Like, you know, I will make a landscape full of cows because I know that this person likes cows, and then I will be able to render it in the sunlight, and I'll put their name in big block letters because I know how to use model text, and I can do their rendering, and it's cheap and easy for me, but it's also expressive and it's meaningful to the other person. And that's always been really fun, to sort of like, how can you take the stuff that's part of your daily life and make it meaningful to other people, you know, which, you know, is, as people who are part of this sort of design world, I think that like we're sort of very lucky to be able to do that. And so, you know, it's I think, you know, you guys are sort of in the same position. Like, it's a pleasure to do, and it's nice to be able to do for other people.
For
So
sure. And
that's always sort of been my feeling about making stuff off the clock with the stuff that we use on a daily basis.
and I mean, even when I first, like, talking about 3D printing, I first encountered 3D printers. I just know you need to get a darn STL out of something. I know Revit, so that's like where I went right away. I started throwing Revit stuff at a 3D printer, you know. So yeah, that's a really interesting point. You use what's at your disposal, right?
Yeah. No, and different things have been differently available at other times. Like one of the things I thought was really enjoyable about Dynamo is that it made cheap and easy and available sort of part of what it was from the very beginning. People conflate, you know, open source and free all the time. Dynamo was both. And it also had this requirement on this other sort of big expensive thing. But if people were already sort of bought into the big expensive thing, the availability of this tool was just part of the package. And that made it really fun when we first started going around with it, because, you know, you show up as a development team and you give things away. It's like, here, have this thing. And then people do different things with it when it's available that way. People do weird stuff with it. I mean, John, I remember when you know, I first met you and you sort of started to get involved with this stuff, and it was just like, I can be a little bit goofy with this thing. Like, it's possible to do that, and it opens up creativity that way, of not feeling like the clock is running. I mean, back to your idea of like, what do you do when you're off the clock? And I think that part of the premise of what we're talking about here is that when you're off the clock, people behave differently, and they engage different kinds of creative centers of their minds, you know, whether, you know, it would be great if we could sort of engage those parts of our minds all the time. Maybe it would be exhausting, but, you know, I think that free stuff, cheap stuff, available stuff changes people's mindsets about how they want to engage with them and how they can be creative with them. You know, the stuff that I've gotten much more involved with recently is I do a lot of like plotter art now, which is, you know, 2D oriented work, you know, very much sort of abstractions of three-dimensional reality. But one of the things that's really appealing about it is that, you know, I've got a 3D printer and I've got like other stuff that sort of makes solid things that are physical objects out there in the world. The fun thing about plotted things, so I do a lot of things with it. I've got like a little robot printer that it goes on an XY axis, and then it has an up down for the pen. Super dumb, pretty cheap technology. It's been around for years and years and years, but you can strap on whatever kind of pen or writing implement or butane flame creating thing if you really are going to get out there with it. And, you know, there's a couple things that happen. Like, it's cheap, so I know I can experiment with it and break it and it won't be terrible. Like, I put a router on the end of it and the motor started making really weird noises because it wasn't supposed to carry something that heavy. But that the other thing that it does is that it makes flat things on that you can stick in a drawer, and it's not going to take up all the space in your house, right? So the impact of being creative is low. Like, I don't have to worry about like, well, if I make this thing, where am I going to put it? I do a lot of pottery. Well, I used to do a lot of pottery. I'd like to do more pottery. But the thing with pottery is like, if you commit to actually, you know, sinking all of that energy into baking it and, making it a real permanent piece of rock. What are you going to do with that rock? Like,
Now you have this whole
you,
thing.
you got to find a home for it, and that can be nice too, because that can be gifts, but it's also kind of like giving people a book. Like,
Yeah.
you give people a book and then they feel obligated to read it. And it's like, oh God, now I got to read this book. Thank you for the ashtray. Now I got to learn how to smoke. So with paper, it's nice just because it can be low impact.
One of the rules I've heard is the hand rule. So for a gift, keep it about the size of your hand. That way, if you give it to someone, it's less obligation to store it somewhere for them. So that's kind of like one of these rules I've heard from somebody is like, if you make it about that size, you're now not giving them like a task.
Or if you can eat it.
Yeah, that's true too. Very true.
If you can consume it, it won't take up space.
There you go.
A lot of gift giving ideas. We have to circle back to this at Christmas time.
There you
All
go.
valuable. All valuable.
Oh, you do need, you need a holiday season gift giving episode for sure.
Yeah.
I think so. And
everyone showing off stuff they made with all their things.
Exactly. Maybe get somebody a big box of macaroni for that macaroni art that we've all made at least once in our life.
And then get them a pick and place robot so that it can pick and place the glue and the macaroni to make the art of their choosing.
Hey, I'd be down with that.
We'll put it on your list.
When you were talking about the idea that you had these things and it all was sort of born from being cheap, frugal, not having to go out and get other stuff. It was something you had access to. I think it still circles back to the idea that even if you had access to all those things, but you didn't enjoy it, you would still go to the local corner store and buy the gift card as opposed to making it yourself. So there still has to be that aspect of creativity and fun. We seem to always circle back to fun here. They'll let you do it, even though it is something that's easy and readily available to you, maybe not for everyone else. So it's not just the fact that it's a cheap for you scenario. There's got to be some fun involved.
I don't want to overrate fun. I also don't want to underrate fun. I think fun is super important. I think that there's another aspect of it being meaningful, which is kind of runs parallel to fun. And it comes into things like gift giving, I think as well. It's easier to do stuff that's meaningful for other people if you're making it yourself. It happens more sort of as part of the process. Like, it may not be fun to make, but it has your impression on it, and it has your thoughts about the other person that you're making it for. And it's kind of lazy in some ways. Like when you go shopping for somebody and you want to find a meaningful gift for them, that's hard. Like to find a mass-produced item or even sort of, unique items that are made for people that, when you go on Etsy or you go to a local crafts fair, which, I think people should go to and they should support. But you really got to hunt around for something that's going to be meaningful for someone because you have something in your mind. But when you're making stuff, it's all kind of right there. You can access something that has, uniquely expresses your relationship to another person.
And oftentimes it's something that's going to last longer, more solid a lot of these times. So like a wallet, for example, you can buy like a mass-produced wallet. But if someone takes the time to actually stitch a leather wallet together or something along those lines, it's probably going to live a long time, a lot of times for some of those handmade things as well.
Yeah, don't get me wrong. Like I make cheap stuff that also falls apart pretty quick.
3D printing, man.
I think I did some drawings on cheese before.
Oh, goodness. That's awesome.
And pumpkins, Oh no, I did. What was this thing? You ever seen this January? There's a competition that happens on social media every January that is called January, Genuary. That is people making sort of generative art, and there's a thematic for it for every day of the month. There's a different thing of like, black and white or, static noise, or VHS was one of them. And for one of them, I can't even remember what the challenge was, but I ended up putting a carrot in my pen plotter and having it draw on hummus that was spread on a piece of pita bread.
I remember seeing that a while back.
It worked.
Sometimes that's, experimentation. That goes back in with that curiosity, you have to give it a try. It may lead to something else. So again, very good point. There's always cleverness that comes up from these conversations, as well as fun and heartfeltness and frugal. So we keep a little more money in that leather wallet that John has stitched together for us. We all circle back around to those same conversations, those same thoughts. I guess as we're getting close to that magical half hour, and before I ask the question that everybody knows that's coming, any final thoughts before we get into the hack of the day?
Final thoughts. I don't know. I think it's, I think it's important for people to sort of figure out what it is that is fun and meaningful for them, and the degree to which they can connect it with their work is people who can do that, I think, are very lucky, because the more that people sort of start feeling, alienated from their work, and that it doesn't feel like it's part of their home. It's always healthy to have sort of like a work-life balance, but I always get a little freaked out when it feels like it's really divided, that like I've gone home from work and whatever I'm doing has nothing to do with it. I feel very lucky that I've been able to sort of connect these things between work and home. Especially now because I spend all of my time at home. We never went back after COVID, really.
I hear that, and I think that's a good way to put it, because if you're experimenting, you're doing whatever it is you're doing with this technology that you use during the day, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing the same thing when you're at home, but you're still touched to it. It's something that you understand. It's something that it's something that you're familiar with. So as you said, it makes your life easier to do whatever it is that you're going to be doing with it. So it's nice to have those things that are separate but the same. And
Indeed.
with that, we have reached, we're past our half hour. So I will ask the elusive question. So Zach, what is your hack that leads us to this topic that we've been chatting about ever so diligently for the last half hour?
I don't have a great answer. I have answers for this, but they're all, they feel like, I feel like my path is littered with many small ones. Like I was thinking, there's a hack that I have that turns RGB data into CMYK data, because there's all sorts of our tools are sort of built for showing things on screens, and if you sort of do a quick internet search, you can find that there's fairly simple math that you can do on RGB color space to turn it into CMY color space, and you can apply it to whatever tool it is that you're using. Like you could do it to Excel, you can do it to Revit, you can do it with Dynamo pretty easily. And it allows you to sort of express that data in other places. I was just describing to somebody the other day that like, I like for Dynamo, I like to put points into polycurves. It's very bad practice, but it allows you to sort of pack things into a container that you can then unpack later on if you want to. It is bad practice. I don't recommend it, but it works. But the thing that in thinking through this, I thought in the end, the hack that I really like that I haven't seen reproduced in other places is my pen rack. So I'm doing all this pen plotting. I've got, I probably have 600 or 800 different markers and pens and cutting tools and brushes and all sorts of stuff, and in a relatively small place. So like, where do you put them so that you can actually see them and access them? I got a shoe rack. I got one of those hanging things that you put like on the back of your closet that has a little pocket in it that's transparent, so you can put your shoes in it and see the shoes clearly through them. And it has pockets for, I think, like 20 different pairs of shoes or 30 different pairs of shoes, and it just hangs against the wall, and you can put a shitload of pens in it. And
There you
they're
go.
all immediately accessible and visible. So like when you look, it's like, I need that kind of blue, and I need this fatness of it, and I need it to be full of ink rather than half full of ink. Like, man, you can see it immediately. So shoe rack for your pen storage, for those who need pen storage. It's a joke around my house that you can't ask me for a pen, because then I also turn on the product management side of me and say, what are you trying to do with your pen? What kind of operations are you going to try and do? Do you need it for a long time? Do you need it for a short time? Because I have a lot of different pens, so it's not an easy question.
That is awesome.
That is amazing. And not only did we come up with a hack that's very practical, it could also be upselling because everyone has one of those that they have sitting in somewhere they're not actually using. So now it goes into your arts and crafts room and you store all of your pens or
That's right.
cutters or your vinyl for your Cricut cut machine or whatever it is that it might
Yeah.
be. So,
I
love
have
it.
a clothing, like, like the things for the shower curtain, the rod. I have one in my garage with all my reels of 3D printing plastic on it.
Ooh,
They're
one
all
of the
just
Yeah.
tension
hanging on it.
hangers. That's a
Yep.
good idea.
Storage of raw materials so that you can admire all of them at once.
There you go.
It's
You
a
can see what all colors
recurrent
you
thing.
have. Same thing.
There's no end to the just wonderful ideas that come from this show. And on that note, we're bringing the big plane in for a landing. Thank you to John and Zach for being here today. Thank you to everyone else for joining us for another episode of Wrenches, Gadgets, and Hacks, where we explore the tools, technology, and time-saving hacks that are shaping the future. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe again somewhere down here. And be sure to stay tuned for more insights into the exciting world of AECO and technology. Until next time, keep building, innovating, and exploring the possibilities.